Hey, I'm Mike Gilliam, and welcome to Let It Rip. We're coming to you from the CUNY TV studios in the shadow of the Empire State Building in New York City. It's official. The midterm elections are over and in the books. And what an election. Democrats went into the contest with many of the pundits and experts predicting a bloodbath. Given the history of the party with an unpopular president sustaining huge midterm losses in the first term, a lot of people expected Democrats to lose both the House and the Senate bigly, or hugely, as the former president might say. That didn't happen. Democrats won the Senate, and when all is said and done, they may be in even better shape than before the election. And a red wave where Democrats hemorrhaged 30 or 40 seats in the House that never materialized. So what happens now? The former president has announced he's running again for the White House, but he's been ridiculed and blamed for the Republicans' underperformance in the midterms. He faces a lot of investigations, too. All of his big endorsements of election deniers in governor and secretary of state races nationwide lost. Now many are saying it's time for Trump to go. On the other hand, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is on the rise, having won re-election and playing the tough guy role to the delight of the MAGA crowd. But is he tough enough to withstand the tactics of Trump? To help us sort out the results and where we go from here, we have three guests. John Jay College political science professor Alexandra Moffett-Bato, former New York State Assemblyman Adam Clayton Powell, and former U.S. Senate candidate, community activist, and New Jersey chairman for the Bernie Sanders campaign, Lawrence Ham. I'm Mike Gilliam, and this is Let It Rip. Alex, a lot of people were expecting a big red wave, but it didn't happen. Why?
I mean, I think it's an interesting question, right? We kind of have these cycles to the electoral process that we expect to repeat over and over again, despite the fact that for the last 10 years, we haven't really had normal results during any election year, right? And so I do think one of the things that we need to keep in mind are the levels of alienation and cynicism in the total electorate, right? Like folks on both red and left are slowly losing interest in the electoral process altogether. And I don't think that we can continue to depend on polling that often leaves out important segments of the population, right? We know that certain populations never pick up the phone for pollers. We know that certain populations are transient, and although they may vote, they may not have a regular home. And so I think that applying the same methods that we have over and over again, both to studying electoral politics as well as thinking about electoral politics, we're being pushed to go beyond that when we think about what we think is going to happen in the future.
Okay. Adam, what's your take on that?
Well, there was no red wave throughout the country. Republicans stand to gain just but a few seats. You know, it's the first midterm of a new president. And certainly Joe Biden being elected in 2020, this being 2022, the average is 17 seat difference. And some Republicans were boasting about a wave of 30, 40, even 50 seats.
I heard 60 at one point.
Right. That did not happen because the Republicans are out of control. They just don't make any sense. People are beginning to see that Democrats are more, they just are more balanced. Republicans are just far right. And again, people are beginning to see that. And as a result, there wasn't that big red wave in the country. There was a red wave in New York State, though.
We're going to talk about that in a bit here for sure. Lawrence, what do you think about that? Why no red wave?
I think there was no red wave because people were tired of the right-wing extremism of the Republican Party, a party that has clearly lifted up the banner of racism and misogyny, and people were tired of it. I think the Supreme Court decision in Roe helped to bring a lot of women out. I think the fact that the Republicans went into court to stop the student loan forgiveness program that President Biden put forward turned them out. It was the second highest turnout of young people in midterm elections. I think the attack on voting rights brought African Americans out. in, again, high numbers. I mean, the numbers didn't match, but were comparable to the numbers in the 2020 election. And I think we're setting up now, things are going to work out for round two in this next year.
Okay. So, Adam, I wonder if there's more working there. I know that in some states, Republicans seem to vote for abortion rights, but then voted for Republican candidates. Is there something else kind of working?
It's just a more sensical approach. I mean, I believe it was Nebraska, a very red state, that had a referendum, as you mentioned, and voters rejected any notion of outlawing abortion in their state, but there are still Republicans. So I think that issue is clear-cut. The majority of this country believes in the choice, and so any Republican that continues to hold on to that, again, does so at their peril.
Alexandra, what about this notion of just bad candidates for some of the Republican seats?
It's interesting, right? I mean, hindsight is always 20/20, and so when people lose, we call them bad candidates. But I think one of the things that Democrats do at their peril is leaning too heavily on this idea that the Republicans are crazy and nonsensical, right? Because we said the same thing about Trump, and for years he was winning, right? And so I think at this point, if we hope to be able to ensure future Democratic wins, we have to worry about building stronger candidates on our end, because at the end of the day, this crutch of the Republicans are crazy is not going to last for very long.
Mm-hmm. Adam, before we move on to another subject, let's talk about that red wave in New York, where we believe it did happen. I mean, we have some real hits in New York.
You have 4 congressional districts that were Democrat that are now Republican. I mean, beginning with Sean Patrick Maloney, upstate, who, by the way, is in charge, the DCCC, of ensuring Democratic victories throughout the country. He lost his reelection to Mike Lawler. Upstate, you have Marcus Molinaro, who lost his special election in the summer, but then he won the election November 8th. And then in Long Island, you have 2 Democratic seats where they were held by Democratic incumbents who did not run for reelection. Kathleen Rice, and she was replaced by Anthony Desposito, and Tom Suozzi, and he was replaced by George Santos. Not to speak of the Assembly, where there were several Assembly members, long-term. Peter Abate was in Assembly 35 years. He lost his reelection. You have Stephen Simbrowitz.
So how do you fix this? Is there going to have to be a change?
Well, I tell you what, that the origins of all of that was the chaos that happened during redistricting. Remember, that was the plan that was thrown out by the courts. They put a master in charge of the district, the Congressional Assembly, not the Senate. That's why you don't hear chaos about the Senate, but the Congressional Assembly. They pitted Carolyn Maloney and Jerry Nadler, 30 incumbents, against each other. And that's what forced Mondaire Jones, from upstate, a congressman, to move down to Brooklyn because he didn't want to face Sean Patrick
Maloney forced him to move.
Well, yes, like I said, but that was all because of the redistricting done by a person outside of, the legislature process.
But they could have taken the maps that were drawn here in the state, but instead of overreaching, right? I mean, didn't we have maps that were given up by the commission that they didn't follow?
Correct. The maps by the commission were too partisan in the eyes of the judges because it went up to the courts, and as a result, they put a person in charge of doing the new maps, and that began the chaos.
Okay. So now let's talk about the former guy and the fact that he's running again. He's heard a lot of backlash over these results. Fair or not fair?
Yeah, fair. I mean, he is in part, large part, to blame for Republican losses. Look, one of the reasons the Republicans only did as well as they did was because of the right-wing judges on the U.S. Supreme Court, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby decision and other decisions, and redistricting. Redistricting and voter suppression were the big culprits in this election. And redistricting and voter suppression is really why we didn't have a blue wave. Were it not for that, Democrats we could right now say that Democrats would be in control of the House of Representatives. There's also another little piece with regard to the red wave here in New York. And that was the fact there was a referendum in a recent election that was on the ballot and this is one of the things that I believe Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez brought out in her critique of the election results here in New York. The party really did not support the referendum on redistricting. Had that referendum question passed, then the Democrats in New York would have had congressional lines more favorable than the lines that they got. And perhaps we wouldn't have had as many losses in New York State as we did have. But the attack on voting rights by this right-wing Supreme Court, voter suppression, I mean, 400 bills were introduced in 49 states, passed in 19 states. All of this helped to get what gains the Republican Party made in this election.
And I think also you have to think about voter alienation and cynicism, right? So you have these federal court decisions that are happening one after the other, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, but also if you look around the city, you'll see ever increasing rates of poverty and homelessness. And I think for a lot of young Black people in particular, surveys show that they're becoming less and less interested in electoral politics. They see it as something that cannot help them. And I think as a party, the Democrats have to take more seriously the issues concerning young people living below the poverty line, because that number of folks in Gen Z and in millennials is ever expanding.
In one sense, I agree with you on that. There are significant numbers of people who are alienated, but we cannot overlook the fact that in the 2020 election, we had the highest voter turnout in the history of the United States. In the history of the United States was the largest voter turnout. And in this past election, we've had one of the highest turnouts of Gen Z and other more youthful generations. But her point is still valid. 94 million Americans did not vote in the 2020 election.
I mean, it's both and, right? Because we have had around 50% of the entire US population that hasn't voted for the last 10 or 20 years, right? So we can celebrate the jumps forward, and we should, right? Without work like y'all, that would not be happening. But as an academic who is particularly interested in the most marginalized, I'm always going to be asking the question about that other 50% that has never entered a voting booth.
Where do you see the Latino vote at this point? I know that in Florida, DeSantis did pretty well there. Do you see that vote leaving the Democratic Party at all, or where do you see that?
No, not so much, although certain Latino groups are mostly Republican or very close to, like Cubans.
Right.
Mexicans and Puerto Ricans have traditionally been more Democratic. The Puerto Ricans in Florida, however, apparently are drinking the Kool-Aid and they are voting Democrat, but not by a huge margin. I think 60-40, 58-42. In New York, it's 85-88% of Puerto Ricans voting Democrat. So let's hope they can see the light.
Well, it's an ethnicity and a class issue, right? So you see the Puerto Ricans that do vote Republican tend to be wealthier, right? Whereas like middle class, working class, folks below the poverty line, those Puerto Ricans and Mexicans are very consistent in their vote for Democrats. And so we have to think about this in terms of both an ethnicity and a class driver in terms of who is voting for whom.
So what needs to happen to fix that in places like Florida? Is there more outreach that needs to be done by the Democratic
More
Party?
outreach, more grassroots, more building a conscience of what's important to us. I mean, working families, working people, women, different disaffected minorities. I mean, the Democratic Party is the party of the future, really.
And this goes to the point that the professor was making earlier. Had many of those people that were in Florida that did not vote, had they voted, it would have been a different outcome. So the Democratic Party has to reach out to new voters, to people who have not voted.
Absolutely.
And if they do that, I think they'll do better in Florida.
Yeah, I have to say that I was impressed with what the young people did this time around.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we're all out of time on this, but right now that's going to have to do it. We touched on a lot of stuff here. I want to thank our guests, John Jay, political science professor, Alexandria Moffett-Bato, former New York State Assemblyman Adam Clayton Powell, and former U.S. Senate candidate and community activist Lawrence Ham. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll have more on the midterms and how Republicans and even some Democrats have been weaponizing the crime issue and whether or not it's really an issue. Stay with us. I'm Mike Gilliam. This is Let It Rip. Welcome back. I'm Mike Gilliam, and this is Let It Rip. We've been talking about the midterms. Now let's look a bit at the campaign and what led to the results. Crime was weaponized in this election. Republicans ran hard on how dangerous it was in Democrat cities. Lee Zeldin used that issue to close the gap on Kathy Hochul, and it was effective. Other candidates across the country used similar tactics, attack lines, and imagery. Black candidates were labeled dangerous and had their images darkened on flyers, and on and on and on. So let's talk a bit about that tactic as it relates to the midterms. Joining me now, we have New York State Senator Jabari Brisport. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Good to have you here. Jabari, Republicans weaponized race during this issue and crime quite a bit. What was your reaction to seeing all of that?
I saw extreme disappointment in my colleagues in government. Republicans frequently weaponize crime and racialize crime. And my disappointment comes from seeing fellow Democrats amplify that rhetoric and justify it in their policies.
Are you talking about the city?
At both the city and the state level. So we have a mayor who ran on a sort of crime panic rhetoric. There's been charts and graphs floating around seeing that since his time taking office, or even since his time launching his campaign, mentions of crime skyrocket in the media, despite not skyrocketing actually in the numbers that are occurring. And that definitely fueled Republican rhetoric, which was then weaponized against Democratic candidates up and down the ballot throughout New York.
Mm-hmm. Do you think he hurt Kathy Hochul?
I would say so, because every time you amplify Republican rhetoric, that's going to harm a Democratic candidate. But even continuously saying that every single crime that he can think of is related to bail reform, whether it is or not, him saying that repeatedly, frequently, allowed Republicans to then blame it on the governor. And that became a thing during the campaign, the general election match between Kathy Hochul and Lee Zeldin.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about cashless bail, because we hear it talked about a lot, but not a lot of explanation. What is it?
So essentially, bail is regards to pre-trial detention. So the time between you are arrested and when you are going to court to be found guilty or innocent, in regards to whether or not you wait for your trial at home or you wait for your trial at Rikers or in a detention center. Mm-hmm. And the purpose of bail is to ensure that someone who is arrested returns to have their trial. And the way it has been weaponized has been to make it seem as though people who have already been determined guilty are being let out scot-free. And again, this is all people that they're awaiting their trial. And so our discussion on bail is the notion of when we are charging a fee to someone pre-trial.
Mm-hmm. And cashless bail?
So cashless bail, we say, someone is allowed to wait at home for their trial. They're allowed, RR, return on reconnaissance, or on supervised release. A few different ways about it, but essentially they are allowed to wait at home before their trial.
Mm-hmm. Now, they've demonized cashless bail to a large degree here, but in reality, the numbers don't play out that way, right? I mean, the number of people who are committing these crimes is nowhere near what they're actually making this look like, right?
It's completely blown out of proportion. Bail reform was a wide and far-reaching success in terms of racial equity, ensuring that people were not locked up before their trial simply because they could not pay a certain amount. Mm-hmm. And it has not been correlating to a huge spike in crime that people are saying it is.
Mm-hmm. Also, like one of the things that we noticed when looking at the numbers is that they ran on this crime issue all across the country. But in reality, while they were using that phrase, Democrat cities, Democrat city
Yeah.
crime cities, all that, the crime really, the spikes in crime were happening in red states, correct?
Yes, I mean, we're seeing the spikes in states with lax gun laws that refuse to invest in social services, that refuse to do things that actually prevent crime. But again, they want to racialize it and weaponize it and say that these, Democrat-run cities, which is coded language for saying, places where a lot of people of color live, are just filled with crime.
Isn't crime like a coded word?
That too, right? And that's the thing. It's that the cities are filled with crime, and then the crime is coming for you next. Is the fear they're trying to stoke.
What did you think about the tactic that Lee Zeldin used in saying that on day one he would get rid of the Manhattan DA?
Again, this has the Republicans have gone really hard on Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg. Again, blaming him for things that do not necessarily correlate to his job description, to the changes in bail reform, and he used it as part of a cudgel to say that this man is causing crime, and I will get rid of this man to end crime.
You mentioned something earlier considering the cash bail, and I kind of wonder about this. Do you think that given the fact that there's been so much hoopla made over cashless bail during this campaign, that it needs to be revisited by you guys up at the state legislature?
I think we need to get to a system. I don't think we've actually solved the original problem. The original problem was that we had a discrepancy on how people are treated by the law based on how much money they had, which is what bail says, is that one person can be accused of something. Again, this is before someone is found guilty, but someone can be accused of something, and if they have $1 million in their bank account, they'll pay bail and they'll wait at home for their trial. And if they have, $1 in their bank account, they will not be able to pay bail and they'll wait at Rikers for their trial. So that we have not fully addressed, and I do think we should continue looking at it until we get to absolute equity in the system.
Okay. So all of this, though, is really aimed at reducing the level of crime that we do have. From where you sit, what do you think needs to be done to actually try to tamp down the crime rates?
I mean, the biggest thing is that we need to stop letting Republicans say that the carceral system and changes to the carceral system are going to be the ways that we tamp down on crime. We need actual investments into our communities. We need more jobs. We need more mental health support. We need more addiction support, better education, and we need stable housing for people. These things are things that will actually address crime rather than doubling down on the carceral state.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that that will resonate, though, with voters at this point, or do you think that by equating crime with minorities and that sort of thing, do you think that's kind of baked this problem in so that the thinking out there now is that, oh no, the only way we can fix this is by eliminating cashless bail and a heavier police presence?
I think it does resonate. I mean, I was phone banking for upstate candidates for this election, and one of them actually brought up bail, and I started talking about investments in the community, and her immediate thing was, I don't think more money is the answer to this problem. And I explained to her respectfully, people who are calling for more incarceration are also asking for more money. They want more money for cops, and they want more money for prison guards, which are things after the crime. I'm saying we put more money into things that would stop the crime beforehand. And then when she heard me talk about mental health supports, immediately a light bulb went off. She was like, yes, we do need more mental health beds. We really do need this. And she agreed with me.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good conversation. I want to thank our guest, State Senator Jabari Brisport, for his insight on all of the issues. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay, we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk about the Georgia runoff. Did you know that the whole runoff idea was set up to suppress the black vote? We're going to tell you all about it. I'm Mike Gilliam, and this is Let It Rip. Welcome back to Let It Rip. I'm Mike Gilliam. Eyes are now focused on the runoff Senate election in Georgia, where incumbent Senator Raphael Warnock and challenger Herschel Walker are facing off in a head-to-head battle. Even though Democrats have already won control of the Senate, the race is extremely important, and will weigh heavily on committee assignments and the ability of Senators Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin to exert control over the Biden agenda. The December 6th runoff pits two black candidates against each other. But the whole notion of runoff elections has a troubling segregationist history. Runoffs were created to suppress the black vote. Under Georgia election law, if no candidate gets more than 50% of the vote, the top two candidates face off in a runoff 4 weeks after Election Day. This only happens in Georgia and Louisiana. Georgia's runoff system began in 1963 when State Representative Denmark Groover Jr. proposed adding a second round of voting to make sure that at least half of all constituents backed a candidate. Now, this all came after he lost an election in 1958 that he blamed on, quote, Negro bloc voting. He was concerned that if blacks voted consistently and together and whites split their vote among multiple white candidates, it would help blacks politically. He thought the runoff would make it tougher for blacks to get elected because it would rally white voters around a single white candidate after the general election. A 2007 study by the National Park Service says 20 years after the runoff system was in place, Groover, a staunch segregationist, admitted, quote, if you want to establish if I was racially prejudiced, I was. If you want to establish that some of my political activity was racially motivated, it was. Now Herschel Walker and his supporters are hoping to use that system to win in Georgia, while Senator Raphael Warnock is looking to win his second runoff and punch his ticket to a full term in Washington. I'm Mike Gilliam. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on Let It Rip.